Hi, good morning, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here on this webinar, the first webinar on 2026 of our International Test Commission. And this is a pleasure to have Professor Matthias Ziegler from Humboldt University in Berlin for this first webinar in the year. And with me, Ariela Lima, social professor here in Brazil, and she will help us on this webinar as well. So, Matthias, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a very pleasure to have you here. Matthias is a professor, have been working of personality and personality assessment, one of the biggest resources in the world about personality assessment. She dedicated a lot of research on faking, social disability, response bias in general, and for sure that's something that is very interesting for the ITC audience as well. So thank you very much to accept this invitation for this webinar, and please welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Felipe, for the kind words. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'd say there are still some people coming in, but probably a good moment to start the presentation, right?
Yes, aware to hear. And
Okay, well then I'll just start from here. If anyone has a question in between, I was told might as well plug it in the chat, and then I'll try to answer the question. Otherwise, we will have time in the end to answer questions and discuss things. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is faking. And I have given it the subtitle From Lab Illusion to a Controllable Real-World Phenomenon. And in a way, the presentation is kind of like a journey through part of my history as a researcher. And that journey started at the end of my university phase when I was finishing up my master's degree, and I had to do an internship, and I worked in a big bank in Germany. And this is kind of like my attitude that I had when I started. I thought, now this is the moment I can apply everything I've learned, the scientific methods and ways in the real world. And basically the reaction I often got was kind of like, people were not really enthusiastic about changing their ways and working on scientific methods or working in a scientific way. I don't want to say that they were working on an inscientific or non-scientific way, but it wasn't really a big fit. And I learned pretty soon that there's one side, that's the science side, and there's the other side. I called it the superhuman resources. So that's the applied field. And in between, there is a gap, and that gap is filled with truths, maybe, but also a lot of, well, let's say, lies. Some of them are implicit, some are more explicit. So there is a big gap between research and science. We call it the science practitioner gap. And it's especially big when it comes to using personality questionnaires. And basically, this is the early 2000s. And my experience at that point was that people were kind of like saying, we're not using personality questionnaires because people are lying on it, or we do use personality questionnaires, but only to get a feeling for the person because it's not really reliable. Or there was the opposite, and people said, well, we're using personality questionnaires because lying doesn't exist. There is no faking. And I will take this as a starting point and lead you through the research program that we've conducted over the past 25 years, basically. And we'll start with questions like, do people actually fake? I know most of you will think this is a stupid question to ask because the answer is clearly on the table, but I want to show how this started for us. And then I'm going to talk about how we can model faking and its effects, and then go on to answer the question what actually faking might be, whether we can prevent faking, and coming back in the end to the question of different types of faking, extending the research from questionnaires maybe to interviews. So let's start. First question, do people fake? These are results from my master thesis. I ran a study where we had several tools to assess achievement motivation. There was a questionnaire, the LMIK, there was a semi-projective tool, the MMG, and there was an objective test in the sense of Cattell. So people were working on a task, not really sure what this is about. You can see the publication year is a span. Of course, it wasn't published in a span. It was published in 2007. But it took us quite a while to get that paper published, mostly because of the results you see here, which are for the questionnaire. You can see the stars, as always, those are the significances. But the first row are effect sizes, cones, Ds, and we have a faking good condition, a faking bad condition, and a control group. And the result back then was, to me at least, not as surprising as it would be today. People can fake upwards, people can fake downwards. The objective test kind of limits the faking upwards. There are no significant results. Effect sizes are a lot smaller. And the semi-projective measure is somewhere in between. But many of the reviewers we got, they basically said, well, that's not relevant because faking only happens in the lab. It's a lab phenomenon. People in the real world do not fake. And one of the meta-analysis that was always thrown in our way was this one by Denise Owens and her colleague Ms. Vesperan. And basically what they did is they looked at correlations between Big Five questionnaire scores and criteria, and then they partialed out the result of people in so-called social desirability scales or lie scales. And if you look at the table, you can see that basically there are no changes. So the argument was, if the test criterion correlation doesn't change, then it cannot be affected by social desirability. So here's your proof. There is no such thing as social desirability in real applicant data. Another study that was thrown our way was this one by the Hogans and Paul Barrett. A very impressive study. You can see here more than 5,000 real-world applicants and then a research sample. And the storyline here is that you have motivated people trying to fake, if there was such a thing as faking. And here you have people not motivated to fake because it's a research sample. And again, if you look at the effect sizes here, it's basically 0. So in that paper, the conclusion was that faking is not a real-world phenomenon. It just happens in the lab. And clearly we were not amused. We didn't believe in this. So our idea was to look a little bit further. Sorry, my Siri caught some word and is telling me something. Okay, now she's done. And the first reassuring thing that happened was another meta-analysis by Berkland and colleagues. And that meta-analysis took out the Hogan paper because what they could show is that on average, there is faking in real-world data. But more importantly, what they reported are huge heterogeneities between studies. And the explanation they provided in that meta-analysis is that depending on the job, people have different faking goals and profiles. Sometimes extraversion is faked more. Sometimes it's even faked in the direction of introversion, and so on and so forth. That's why in the Hogan paper, despite the large sample, the results are hard to gauge because they were applicants from different jobs, so effects might have canceled out. And another study that came to our rescue was a paper by Richard Griffith, one of the titans in the field in the early 2000s. And what he did is he had a study where people applied for a job, they filled out a personality questionnaire, and then they went there and said, well, guess what, there is no job. I'm sorry, but would you mind filling out the questionnaire again in an honest fashion? And then what they did is they simply estimated the difference, the critical difference between the two, the faked one and the true score, so to speak, and they used the confidence interval approach. We will call this here the SEM approach. It's the standard error of the mean that they used, and they said if your two scores are overlapping in the confidence interval, then you didn't fake, but if they're not overlapping, then you faked. And depending on the level of safety you incur, there was a ratio or a rate of 30 to 50% of the people in the applicant sample that faked. So by that time, there was ample evidence that yes, faking happens. It's not only something that happens in the field, in the lab, it really is something that also happens in the field, in high-stakes situations. So taking that for granted, that was kind of like the establishing that there actually is something to look into. There is a research topic, not just a lab phenomenon. But if there is something like this, how can we model it? How can we basically differentiate the variance in a personality score and say that's personality and that is faking, and that's the old substance versus style discussion. So the question is, can we model faking and its effects? And now we are moving from my master thesis to my PhD thesis. And at first, as every good PhD student, or at least a student who's trying to achieve a good result, I looked into the earlier work. How did people back then try to model faking and its effects? And this is a classic paper by Schmidt and Ryan. And they used Big Five data, they used exploratory factor analysis, and they had student samples and job applicant data. And what they could show is that in the job applicant data, there always was a sixth factor, not just the Big Five, and pretty much all the items loaded onto that sixth factor, which they called the ideal employee factor. That's kind of like the first paper to use more sophisticated structural methods to find evidence for such a faking factor, as we might want to call it. And another really important figure in that area here is Martin Bäckström from Sweden. He was the first to use structural, or at least to my knowledge, one of the first to use structural equation modeling and systematically compare different models based on Big Five or hexacode data. And what he could always find is that if you use regular items, you get this bifactor structure which fits best, and there you have this general factor that loads all items. And based on this data, he came to the conclusion that this actually is a faking factor. But then again, it's just correlational. The ideal employee factor is just correlational. This is just correlational. So how can we be sure that this really is faking? And my supervisor back then, Markus Bühner, said, well, the best way to prove this is if you design an experimental study. So what we did is a within-person design. We had 341 participants. We split them randomly into two groups, a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group did have specific instructions, like you're applying for, these were psychology students, so we said you're applying for an internship that you really want, and here's the job description, and you first have to pass a personality questionnaire, but make sure that you are not caught as a cheater, because cheaters will be excluded. So we didn't want to have these huge effects and make it a little bit more realistic. And they filled out the NEO twice, once in an honest condition and once under these faking instructions. And in the control group, they just filled out the personality questionnaire twice with the same instruction. Second time, they were told not to try to repeat the results from the first time. And in between, they had to go take a lot of other tests, also cognitive ability tests. So it wasn't test, but there happened a lot of stuff in between. First thing we did is we ran an analysis of covariance to actually see whether people really faked. Not going to go into this because the results were pretty clear. There was a lot of faking happening. More importantly, we designed a structural equation model of all traits, which looked kind of like this. So here, for example, you have the same, we used item parcels, but let's say item for the first measurement point and the second measurement point. And you can extract the trait that's the common across all the items for one trait. But you can also extract these general factors. It's a common method factor. The original paper labeled it faking or social desirability factor, but the reviewers didn't like it in the figure. So we changed it to common method variance. And in the text, we discussed that the most likely explanation is social desirability. We came up with a number of hypotheses regarding the means of these common method factors or social desirability factors, the correlations, and specifically in comparison between the control group and the experimental group. And to cut a long story short, first of all, the model fit comparably decently well, considerably well. And here you find the correlations in the structural model between the big five. Openness was excluded because it wasn't faked. It wasn't part of the job description. So we left it out. And as you can see, the latent correlations, so those are correlations already corrected for attenuation, they really drop substantially with only a correlation left between agreeableness and extraversion. All the other correlations are very close to zero. And keep in mind, this is an experiment, so we were pretty sure that the changes we see from measurement point 1 to 2, or the differences between experimental and control group, are most likely due to the experimental variation, which was the instruction to fake on the questionnaire. Here you see the mean differences, quite a pronounced shift in the common method factor for the experimental group. So the influence also increases, the correlation also changes in the experimental group between these common method factors, so there is something happening. Those were all things we had anticipated and written hypotheses about. So on the whole, we came to the conclusion that yes, faking can be modeled as a latent variable influencing all faked variables. If we control for it, it substantially reduces the correlations. Around the same time, Martin Beckström and his colleagues, they also chose an experimental approach, but a different one. They phrased items in a neutral way, so neither socially desirable nor undesirable, and the same result happened. With those neutral items, this general factor disappeared. So there you have an independent second experimental approach to this, showing that the general factor in these personality questionnaires most likely is faking, social desirability, whatever you want to call it. If you don't correct for this, you have worse discriminant validity, so the big five have stronger correlations than what they should have. The internal consistencies go up because you have two variance sources, and you often have problems establishing factorial validity evidence. There's also awesome work by Beatrice Ramstedt and her group who look at this from an acquiescent point of perspective. We also included academic performance in our analysis to see whether the predictive power to predict academic performance comes from this faking factor or from the big five. We did not find evidence that the faking factor predicted academic performance. And another approach that we chose is, and this was with Eric Danai, former PhD student of mine, we combined self-ratings and two other ratings and modeled this together, and again the general factor disappeared. So on the whole, using different approaches, we came to the conclusion that using this bifactor approach, we can model social desirability or faking, but then it's just basically a latent variable with lots of variance. The question is, what exactly is it? So this finishes the next phase in our research program and starts the next one. What actually is faking? How is it? What is it comprised of? And we chose three research approaches. The actual process we tried to look into. Then we spent some time on differentiating the ideas of whether faking is continuous or more a categorical variable. And also, I'm going to talk about our approaches to looking into the nomological net of faking. So when we started at looking at the actual process, we of course again went to the literature first, and what we did find is that there are quite a few models of faking in the literature. I've cited two prominent models here, one by Snell, the other by Jill Ellingson and McFarland. However, when you look at the models, they're not actually process models of faking. They're more like process models of the intention to fake. This is the model by Jill Ellingson and Anne McFarland. So they say you have expectancy factors, instrumentality factors, and valence factors. So things like, is this position really important to me? Is it very likely that the other applicants are faking? Will I get another job if I don't get this one? All of these things They work together, kind of like the expectancy value theory and motivation, and create the motivation to fake. And this combines with the ability to fake to create faking behavior. But while this is very appealing and seems to be very true to the point, the big question is, well, what is faking behavior actually? And that's what we wanted to find out. And we didn't find a lot of literature on what faking actually is, how people actually are doing it. The one paper I did find is by Chad Roby here. He used verbal protocol analysis for 12 participants. By that time, we had also already written our paper. We weren't quite as lucky as Chad with publishing it, because this is qualitative work. Qualitative work still is very difficult to publish in the field, but I'm going to expand on this in a moment. What they came to here is that when they look at the verbal protocols, they did find 3 classes of fakers. Honest responders, so despite the situation telling you that faking might give you an edge, they still answer in an honest way. And then there are some people who fake slightly and others are more extreme. And while this is still, again, very appealing and kind of attractive as an explanation, it leaves open the question, what actually is slight faking, or what actually is extreme faking? And that's what we looked at in this paper in 2011. It was published in 2011. As I said, we wrote it a lot earlier. But qualitative work is really a hard sell. What's this based on? If you look at the upper part of the model, you see we have comprehension, we have retrieval and judgment, and we have mapping. And that's basically the ideal item answer process as it was suggested by such prominent researchers like Turan Go or Krosnick. And we also ran a verbal protocol analysis, a think aloud technique. People were given personality questionnaires with a faking instruction. And what we did find in addition to these phases of item answering is this initial step. So people read the items, they understood what the item is about, and then they made a quick judgment, like, is that item important for my future employer with regard to making a decision? So does this tell my future employer something important about me and my fit to the position? And if the answer was yes, then what we saw is a faking process or a social desirability process. But if the answer was no, then some people said, well, that's not relevant, so I'm going to give an honest answer. And other people said, it's not relevant, but I still don't want to make a mistake, so I'm going to cross in the middle of the 5-point scale, for example. And what we found here is that there were always person and situation factors playing a role, but that would be a different presentation, because that was the starting point for us to go more into the person situation debate. But here what we did find is that general mental ability played a role, but also certain dark triad features like narcissism. How did we know this? Because we also had quantitative data of the people on these tools or constructs. But the important thing really here is that we have this initial phase or this initial evaluation, and we have some idea about how person and situation factors moderate these specific stages of the item answering process. But on the whole, this is still a very crude model. That's why I was happy when I was approached by Jessica Röhner and Astrid Schütz a few years ago. And they had this huge data set, as you can see here, more than 400 people. And they had filled out personality questionnaires, again with the think aloud technique. And again, sometimes a fake bad, sometimes a fake good condition. So we were able, and when I say we, I mean that Jessica did most of the work here, to run a qualitative analysis. Paper was published 2 years ago in the National Journal of Selection and Assessment. And as you can see, again, we find the 4 stages of item answering as they were proposed by Turan Go or Krosnick, so that's fine. But what we also find is a very detailed list of specific strategies, and we basically found 4 clusters of strategies, which then can be broken down into 22 global and 13 specific behaviors. And I really recommend reading the paper, because what we do there is we explain all of these in more detail, but you can also see that they are combined in various ways. So faking really is a very heterogeneous approach, and not everyone is doing it in the same way, and there's not just one way that takes you to Rome. There are lots of ways that lead you to your apparent goal. We also found that there are differences between faking good and faking bad, and what I can say again is that is one of the papers that I'm really proud of in my career. It was a hard way to just obtain the results, but again, it's also very hard to get qualitative results published. So the actual process, my takeaways here is that despite the seemingly easy way to use a bifactor, it is very difficult to capture what the actual faking process is, because we have to look into the heads of people as they are changing the answer on a single item or several items. What seems to be pretty clear is that they weigh the importance of each individual item. That's something that Jessica and we did find in the more recent paper as well. But it also casts a question on what actually is the situation, because we keep talking about the faking situation. But as I said, that's a different kind of research that we could talk about. And also the dark triad plays a role here, but again, that would be a different presentation. And of course, another takeaway is that qualitative work sometimes really is necessary to crack the nut open and really see what happens. Now, when we talk about this actual faking process or the differences there, another idea that we pondered and where we were a little bit uncertain is this differentiation between faking as a continuous variable, like the ideal employee factor or Martin Beckstrom's work or our own work, or whether faking actually is a categorical approach. And that's more the idea by Chad Roby and such people like Mike Ziegler. They used rush models, mixed rush models, and they always find these extreme and slight fakers and a proportion of honest respondents. The approach that we chose back then is, or the question we raised back then is, well, in the literature, there's also the established fact that we do have midpoint and extreme point respondents. And if you look at such threshold charts, so here, for example, we have items on the x-axis, the y-axis contains the item difficulty, and we have 2 classes that were found in a data set for the Big Five. And as you can see, this class here, they have no problems to switch from one category to the next in the middle area, but you really need to push them quite hard to make this class cross in the extremes. Whereas this group here, it's different, doesn't take much, and you're already in the extremes. So we have an extreme point responding class and a midpoint responding class. And if you look at such threshold plots for extreme and slight fakers, they look kind of like alike. So the question we had is there maybe a connection between these distinct response styles as midpoint and extreme point responding and the response set of social desirability? Well, this is the first study that we conducted with Christoph Kemper back then. Again, we had 2 measurement points, one honest and one fake condition, quite a large sample. We classified the honest responses into midpoint and extreme point responding using mixed rush models, and we classified the faking condition into slight and extreme faking. We did not find a class of honest respondents here. Maybe our data set was too small. And then we just ran a chi-square test there, and what we can see is that there was no substantial change in classification between the measurement occasions, and that's a polite way of saying, looks like this is the same thing. You call it tomato, we call it tomato, but it doesn't really say that there is slight and extreme faking. It's more likely that what we pick up there is midpoint and extreme point responding. We wanted to dig in here a little bit further, so we ran another study We did this together with a group by Richard Griffith, had almost 500 participants. Those are the participants that I talked about earlier, who were initially told that there's a job to be had, and then, sorry, there is no job, and then they used this confidence interval or SEM approach, standard error of the measurement, to classify them into honest and fakers. What we did is we tried to combine the ideas of faking as a continuous variable, and we did this by designing a structural equation model that includes the ideas of a latent change score model. So we have, for example, conscientiousness under the honest condition, and we have the same construct under the faking conditions, and then we used a latent change score approach, very popular in developmental psychology, or now in recent years also in personality psychology. Basically, the latent change score contains all the differences between the two latent variables, but we also included a factor mixture model here, which would be the slight and extreme fakers, but we also controlled for midpoint and extreme point responding. And then we could basically get factor scores for the latent change score. That's the continuous faking variable. And we could get the class membership for the latent factor mixture or the mixture factor. And then we could correlate this with the classification as a faker or non-faker based on the standard error of measurement. And what we could see is that the correlation with the latent difference score was quite substantial, whereas with the class membership, it was a non-significant and also very small correlation. So that we came to the conclusion here that if we talk about faking, it's probably more of a continuum than a qualitative class. Fine and good, but that still raises the question, what's really in it and what's right and left next to it. So that's the question of the nomological net of faking. And here we started with the seminal work by Del Paulus, also a very prominent figure in the field. And in 2002, in a book chapter, he summarized the extensive literature on social desirability and proposed this two-tiered model where he said, in principle, there is like a general social desirability factor, but that can be broken down into an egoistic and a moralistic bias. It's kind of like the content or the theme of faking. But then you can have different addressees. You can fool yourself, that's self-deceptive enhancement or self-deceptive denial, or you can try to fool others, impression management, so that's agency management and communion management. And based on this, Doreen Bench, PhD student of mine, she ran a study where she said, well, there are all these different operationalizations of this positivity bias. So you have your lie scales, they measure social desirability. You have overclaiming, which supposedly measures social desirability. You have overconfidence, that is a construct that was suggested by Lazar Stankov and colleagues in the 90s. But all of these suggest that there is a distortion between the truth and your answer in a positive direction. And if that were true, then there should be a common core. All the measures should basically have something in common. So Doreen collected data from quite a large sample and then ran factor analysis. And what she did find is something that has been reported before. If there is a factor that is loaded by one of these indicators of the positivity bias, like the lie scale, Marlowe-Brown, or here Del Paulus's BIDR, or whatever, then these factors typically also include variance from constructs that is substantial, like the Big Five or cognitive ability. The only factor that we found which potentially wasn't affected by substantial variance is this egoistic bias. Here we have the Marlowe-Brown scale, we have the BIDR, and we have the second factor of the Marlowe-Brown scale. So that kind of looked promising. However, in a follow-up analysis, we try to make the most or leverage facilitate this change score approach again. So we had data from honest and faking conditions. We had a fake bad and we had a fake good condition. For each of the 5 traits of the big 5, we ran models and extracted a factor score for this latent change score, which reflects faking. And then we tried to model a general factor on top as the overall faking variance that worked under the fake good and the fake bad condition comparatively well. However, when we tried to test these 2 models for measurement invariance, it didn't, not even configurable invariance held. So these clearly are different things, faking bad and faking good. And most importantly, we try to replicate this egoistic factor. Here again, we have all kinds of indicators, lie scales, whatever you want to name it. We do find the typical 2 factors. And now we can predict these 2 faking scores and see if these things are really substantial indicators of faking, then they should have significant regression rates, which they do, but in the wrong direction. That was the problem here. So yes, they were predicting faking bad or faking good, but in the wrong direction. So in that paper here, we came to the conclusion that, and we are not the first ones who came to that conclusion, that such lie scales, or whatever you want to call them, are probably not doing the job they are supposed to do. And at this point, I want to introduce a definition that we came up with. And in this case, we is Caroline McCann, who's now in Sydney, and Richard Roberts, who's in the industry now. And our definition of faking at that point was faking represents a response set. So it is not a style, which means it changes with the situation, and all the results I've shown you over the past 50 minutes support that, aimed at providing a portrayal of the self that helps a person to achieve personal goals. So it's a motivated, conscious decision to really distort your goal. It's not the self-deceptive part. Faking occurs when this response set is activated by situational demands and person characteristics to produce systematic differences in test scores that are not due to the attribute of interest. So that's more the technical definition that we have looked into. And we also added a book on this. It's now 15 years old, but I think most of the ideas in there are still interesting to see. So the nomological net here, the takeaways are, what we do see is antecedents and actual faking behavior. The antecedents are in the situation, they're in the person, there are certain dark traits that potentially predict this behavior. The qualitative work we looked into kind of shows the actual behavior. We did see that these SDR scales are at least questionable. And we also saw that there is no single faking construct. Remember, faking bad, faking good, but also Dell's idea with the 2 tiers. So yes, we can model faking potentially as a bifactor, for example, but maybe the bifactor is not the same in every data set and in every situation. So this still raises a lot of questions, and we have achieved, in my opinion, quite a bit, but not really answered the question what to do with faking. And I could talk about this new approach by Anna Brown and Ulf Böckenhold, but I was told that Anna is going to give a presentation here at some point or another, and I'm sure she's going to talk about it, so I'm not. But I'm going to take it direct to the next step, because this is the next step in our own research program, where we asked ourselves, well, we know a lot about faking now, but can we actually prevent it from happening? And again, a look into the earlier work, people experimented with warnings, and there are some indicators that, yeah, maybe this works, because if you look at the means, then there are no longer differences between an honest group and a faking group. But then there's a paper by Richard Griffith which shows, well, that didn't really work, because what happens is that some people are so afraid that they get caught that they actually lower their scores, and others think, well, you're not fooling me, there's no way you're going to find out that I'm faking, so they're really pushing the limits again, and then the mean goes down. Looks like people on average didn't fake, but in reality you just gave fakers a bigger window. The neutralized items, again, that seemed promising. I've talked about that. Martin Beckström did really great work there, but there's a paper by him and Björklund which shows as soon as you put this into high stakes settings, so people actually apply for a job, it no longer works because the neutral items in a neutral situation are no longer neutral. We talked about social desirability scales, not our approach. And back then, what we looked into is this idea of Thurstonian IRT that Anna Brown suggested. There was a meta-analysis by Chow and Drasko in 2019, and they could already show that, yes, if you use such forced choice questionnaires with Thurstonian IRT, then your faking scores go down. But what is basically happening here, classic experiments, honest condition, faking condition, you compare the two scores, you get an estimate, and on the whole, the effect sizes are much, much lower compared to a rating scale, but they're not zero. And the culprit here most likely is emotional stability, because it's pretty easy to pick in such a multiple choice or forced choice questionnaire to see that being emotionally unstable, not good at regulating yourself, that's probably never a good thing in a work setting. And that's what our own research also shows. People have an easier time to pick out these things, and we do find in our work that there's still support for this general factor, but only for emotional stability items. So for those of you who are not familiar with this forced choice approach, you provide people with 2, 3, 4 statements. They're matched by social desirability. People are then asked what's most like you, what's least like you. And then based on the selection, you can basically transfer this into the ranking of the constructs behind these answers. So if you say, I like personality psychology more than I like stats, then in the comparison of construct 1 versus 2, construct 1 loses. And you can basically run through 6 such comparisons, and there's only one comparison here, and that's the one between construct 1 and 3, where we know nothing, but Anna suggested an imputation method to help us deal with this. And then you get a vector of lots of zeros and ones, kind of like in a personality questionnaire or in an intelligence questionnaire. And then you can run a structured equation model on top and actually extract normative scores. And in the past 10 years, we have applied this technique, and we've created several questionnaires, one for the grade 8, for example, one for the big 5, one for the big 5 in situations, also for a personality or vocational interest profiler here for the RIASEC things. And it always works out nice, and we do find really good evidence for reliability, test criterion related evidence, really, really interesting. But it's a lot of work, really a lot of work. It's complicated, and it takes some time to make this happen. Okay, and now I'm coming to what we're currently working on, and that's after spending almost 25 years looking at faking in a personality questionnaire area. What about faking in selection interviews? And again, there is a lot of literature there, and here I have a model from McFarland, and they talk about impression management tactics, and there are verbal tactics and non-verbal tactics. This is a little bit of an abbreviation that I created. Their model is a little bit more complex, but you do find lots of things that are similar to what Del Paulus suggested in his two-tiered model. So assertion, that's kind of like duistic things. Defensive tactics are often things where you try to show your moral superiority or being a good person, like the moralistic bias. And all these things, they're very similar, or at least when you read it, you're like, oh, I've heard that before, in a similar direction. So what we try to do here in a paper, it's a PhD student of mine, who's now a postdoc, Tony Lee, is try to see as a proof of concept, can we build a bridge from typical impression management to faking or social desirability in a questionnaire? And we were lucky enough to get a data set from colleagues from Italy. And what they had is they had a kind of like a selection scenario simulation. So people first were invited to present themselves to a potential employer by taping a short video, 30 seconds to a minute. This is our source for impression management. But then they were also given a Big Five questionnaire and told, fill out the questionnaire as always. What we did here is we used this bi-factor approach. We created a latent factor that reflects social desirability. We interpret it this way. Look at the first part of the session here. And now we have two sources. We know the amount of faking people have in a personality questionnaire, but we also know how they try to create a certain impression when they use videos. And we bring this together in a machine learning approach, a so-called entrance model. That's a supervised learner. The criterion here is the social desirability in a regression task, but we also use the classification task where we use this standard error of the measurement approach to classify as a faker and non-faker. So we had a classification or a regression task. The machine learning approach always is this entrance model. And as features, we used the videos. The data set was really small, so we used some data augmentation methods. And keep in mind, at this point, I'm only trying to present this to you as a proof of concept and that there is something to this idea. As always, when you use machine learning, we use the complex k-fold, in this case a threefold group split, to ensure that there is not too much overfitting. And here are the results for the prediction task and for the classification task. So the entrance, that's our model. We compared it with the random forest, for example, but also with a simple neurological network approach. And here we have the correlation between the actual factor score for faking using the bi-factor approach and the prediction made by the machine. And 0.27, that's not huge, but keep in mind we have videos where you present yourself and we predict social desirable behavior in a questionnaire. So that's quite a stretch that this bridge has to cover. And for the classification task, 71% of the people were classified correctly. And that's also evidence that this is sensitive and specific and not just putting everyone into a certain class. The important task that I gave Tony is, I said, I want to see where the machine actually looks at. And what we then did is, or what Tony did is, he used interpretable machine learning, came up with these heat maps where we can see what's the machine actually looking at. And here, for example, you have a male and a female high in social desirability, and the colored places is where the machine looks at. So it's the mouth region, it's the eye region, and it's not the hair here, it's actually movement, because keep in mind, it's a video that we fed. And we showed this to a colleague of mine, Ursula Hess, who's an expert in mimicry and in facial emotion recognition. Didn't tell her what this is about and asked her, what do you think the people are doing there? And she said, that's impression management, smiling, leaning forward, making contact. We also had some external ratings and confidence tests, like significance tests. Importantly, in the low SDR group, the machine didn't really look at anything in the face. Basically, it looked at the wall, which always is a problem, right? The machine shouldn't look at the wall. But in this case, our interpretation is there is no indicator of honesty. So this is random, yes, but there is no signal for being honest. There are signals for extraversion or for conscientiousness or whatever, but not for being honest. So the machine has no way of picking up anything, and it's just noise that we see here. So in that case, it's not overfitting, it's just desperation by the model, I guess. So I'm coming to a conclusion here. I mentioned work with Leo Schünemann in his dissertation. He's finished now, but we still have one or two papers that we want to push out. And one is, how fakeable is this forced choice approach really? And I can give a small spoiler here and say that if you look at the domain level, as I said, then it's mostly emotional stability. But the interesting thing is what happens at the facet level. And there we see that if people try to fake emotional stability, they pay the price for it in other facets where their scores are then a little bit lower, but there's no systematic way this is done. Sometimes some people decide to lower their scores in agreeableness or in conscientiousness. So this is really interesting. And if you look at the facet level effect sizes, then you mostly see close to zero effects. So each facet itself is really hard to fake in this design. We're also going to continue working on this nomological net approach, faking bad versus faking good versus honest. Here we're going to apply Anna and Ulf's new method, and I'm doing this together with Sabah Rashid, and actually she's the one doing the grunt work here, and we're going to use measurement and variance tests again to compare these. So that's going to be very interesting, currently writing up the analysis. So preliminary answers: do people fake? Yes. In the lab and in the real life. Can we model faking? Yes, more likely as a continuous variable than a discrete one. What is it? We've provided a definition, but it's not easy. It's really a complicated phenomenon. Can we prevent it? The jury is still out. Clearly, these forced choice tools are a huge step forward. They are really cool, but they might not take out the whole faking process. Is faking? Meaning, is faking in a questionnaire the same as faking in an interview? Yeah, maybe, and we are working on this, and there's strong indication. And this could basically put two very interesting literatures together and hopefully advance the field quite a bit. So my outlook is there's still a lot of research to do and fun to be had working on this seemingly dry topic. What else are we working on in my group? And as I said, those would be different talks, but in a way they were always related to this faking work, state-trait relations, the dark triad, our OFTSI model, which is about learning. We're also creating or helping to create selection tests for students and for the bachelor in psychology. So that's quite a lot of work for the group. And I want to finish here by saying thank you to the people who have helped me create this work, and to be fully honest, probably did most of it. And I have the pleasure of just summarizing what they came up with here. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm a bit over time, I fear, but hopefully we have enough time for your questions now. You're still muted, Philippe, I guess.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Matthias, for your outstanding presentation. For me, it's a very pleasure to have you here, and here you're summarizing the whole literature about faking, and see how much work have been done in the past 20-25 years is impressive, and for sure it summarizes your own research agenda, and also present some very robust evidence that faking is important to at least think about in different contexts. And if you assess people in terms of motivation, personality, vocational interests, and so on, we should pay attention on faking social desirability. Thank you so much for summarizing all this for us. And now we do have some times for quick questions. And I also like to thank you for people from all part of the world, from Brazil, England, I saw Italy, Lebanon, and thank you so much for being here. Ariella, can you present some one or two questions, please? Okay.
Yeah, just let's put questions here so everyone can see it.
I do see two questions in the chat. One is by Anna. Maybe it's Anna Brown, if that's the case. Hi, Anna. Whether modern ethics standards will allow faking designs like the one Richard used there. Well, that design actually went to the internal review board, so that had ethics approval. But yeah, I wasn't involved in obtaining that ethics approval, but I'm sure it would be difficult today to work with such a ruse. I agree. I'm not sure if that's a good thing for research in general, but for the society and for the standing of psychology in the society, it's probably a good thing to apply very high standards to ensure this. So yeah, hi Anna, good to read from you. So next question here that I see is detecting subtle faking behavior as opposed to more overt attempts. Well, this bifactor approach, but also the one that Anna and Ulf came up with in their last paper, that is ideal for detecting all kinds of faking, because the extent doesn't really matter. It is, both approaches are sensitive to the variance. The approach by Anna and Ulf basically for each item estimates the amount of true score variance, that's the trait in there, but also the amount of variance that might be due to faking, and you get a propensity, how likely is it that the person is a faker, how big is the influence of the faking variable there. So that approach is very sensitive to this idea that not everyone fakes in the same way, but all the continuous approaches pay justice to that approach, I guess. And the follow-up question there is, what methods best detect that as opposed to forced choice, which reduces it? That's correct, forced choice reduces it. And these other methods, they detect it. My problem is a very hard word, but my fear with these other methods is that they are very situation specific. So you collect data in a large data set, you come up with this model, but these loadings, they are, there's a term, fungible weights. So they're very sensitive to situational changes. So maybe for the next job, which is slightly different, maybe those weights no longer apply. So it's very difficult to use these correction methods and be sure that they work or generalize across a large situation space. So I hope that answers the question. And then there's one, what role does response time play in detecting careless responding or faking? Well, that's an interesting one, because that has been around for really a long time, supposedly being the solution. And I know that there are meta-analysis, and there is something to it. People respond faster when they're lying, but then it gets more complicated whether the item is positively keyed or negatively keyed. But if this would work so fantastic, I'm sure that we would see a lot more of this in the applied field. And then you have all these technical issues. What computer are you working on? How's the reaction time measured there? There might be age differences. So I think this is an interesting feature, probably something to look into with regard to what actually happens in your head, because all these processes are highly automated. I'm not so sure if it's the solution in the applied field to actually address this topic. Yeah, and that's, of course, that's the question, how viable is it to apply statistical corrections to scale scores? Well, there are tools that have internal lie scales. I'm not going to name names, but you know what we're talking about here, I guess. And then if you read the manuals, it typically says, if the tool tells you the person lied, it's in the discretion and experience of the assessor to decide whether to correct the scores or not. And that always raises flags in my book, because the experience, we know from meta-analysis, is typically not a predictor for good assessments. So yeah, that's a problem. But if you apply this bifactor approach, it's a similar problem in principle. So if push comes to shove, you would have to justify in front of a judge why someone who has high scores on conscientiousness is getting reduced a little bit, and then I see issues there, that's for sure. That's why in the applied field I always recommend these forced choice tools at the moment, because there at least we know the mechanics under the hood a little bit better. And
you have time for one more
there's
question.
the final one here. In high stakes contexts, which combination of measurement design and statistical modeling best balances resistance to fake with transparency and fairness? Fairness is yet another hot issue here. Transparency probably is easy to achieve with the forced choice questionnaires, because you can basically explain people what it is. The faking resistance is a different topic. As I said, emotional stability is often easier to pick out. If you have very specific jobs, people might actually find out what what domain is really important here. However, when we do consultancy, we in general always recommend to look at the facets and not the domains anyway, and use a real broad facet measure, like, not the BFI2, which is a great measure for research purposes, but maybe not for the applied field for several reasons. But if you go into the applied field, you have facet measures for the big five with, I don't know, 30, 40 facets. And then if you have these forced choice approaches, it's almost impossible for a regular applicant to guess what item belongs to what facet and what facet is actually important for the job that I'm applying for. And I think that's quite a fair approach if you are transparent about this. So at the moment, that's what we recommend when we consult companies, to use these tools.
Yeah, I guess we done with our questions. Well, I have one quick question, Matthias. You probably, I mean, you answer about the neutralizing items, right? But we also can do the opposite. We can increase the terms of the social desirability, manipulating the content of the item in terms of the how the items are thrown to be faked. Do you think it's a feasible way to deal with faking in personality? Or do you think it's kind of the same as the neutralizing? My question is, the faking depends only on the contest or the item content as well?
Look, I'm pretty sure it depends on the content as well. That goes back to the work by Peabody in the 1960s,
Yeah,
who found
yeah,
out that the popularity of an item is highly correlated with the desirability of an item. It's not perfect, the correlation, but it's really up there. So clearly it's in the content, but
yeah,
if we say that once you contextualize the items or you apply them in a certain field, you also restrict the situations that are relevant. So sometimes you have a typical item where you say this is desirable in these conditions, but not in these conditions. But if you apply it in a certain field, you might only pick a certain set of situations where a behavior or content that is desirable in most situations just isn't desirable, because that's not what you're looking for. And that's what I feared, that if you change the application context, then what was desirable in one might not be desirable in the other, and that would affect the loadings. But I know that you're working on that and
yeah,
with large language models to get this bridged and not have
yeah.
the need to actually collect a lot of data all the time. And I think that's really a beautiful, a very innovative approach to solve that riddle, maybe.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, thank you, Anna Brown, for the comments, and we hope can have her on this webinar in the future as well. It'll be a very pleasure to be here. So again, Matthias, thank you so much for your time, for enlightening us of the complex complexity of the faking in social desirability models. We know that social disability and faking in general are in our data for almost a century now, but we still figure out how to deal with. And this is a very interesting point. And thank you so much for your time and for your work to present here today. And thank you, Ariella, for being here as well and help us on this webinar too.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
everyone. Thank you,
Thanks to
Professor
the audience
Matthias.
for sticking with us for an hour.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and see you on the next webinar next month. We probably will call the next webinar in a few days, or maybe next week, but will be about artificial intelligence. So see you on the next webinar.
See you.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Bye.